Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some Italian-inspired fantasy recommendations. In general, the other day I was just going to make a video about books that I recommend that are set in Italy or are in some way related to Italy, because I feel like I read a lot of those and I always tend to at least semi-enjoy them just because I'm obsessed with Italy, so I really love the setting. But when I sat down and I was making my list, I wanted there to be a fantasy section. And it wound up being that I think I had 6 recommendations for fantasy. So I thought I should just make that its own video, its own part of this, because I feel like all of these are really great and they deserve their own time in the sun. So this is Italian inspired fantasy. And so most of the time, I think there's only one book, one series that I'm going to recommend that actually truly does take place in Italy as like historical fantasy, but everything else takes place in a truly fantasy world that is adjacent to Italy. So let's go on and get into my list. I feel like there are going to be a few here that you're probably expecting to see. So the first one that I want to mention is, I think, the best. It's really one of my all-time favorites. This is just in general to me an all-time favorite fantasy read, and that is A Brightness Long Ago by Gavriel. I, for some odd reason, just could not find my copy of this. I say for some odd reason, but really all of my books are sitting on stacks in various places on the floor as I wait to make decisions about what I'm going to do about my bookshelves. So I know it's upstairs somewhere, but I didn't feel like digging it out. A Brightness Long Ago is set in a world that is very equivalent to, let's say, medieval Europe. 90% of what Gavriel writes is set in this world, though not specifically in this Italy section. He does have other books set in this kind of Italy quarter, and I think they're all really great, but A Brightness Long Ago is far and away his best book, in my opinion. I think it is so dreamy. This is about 2 condottieri, so 2 mercenaries, and they actually have historical equivalents. So in a way, Gavriel is retelling some historical events from the late medieval, early Renaissance period of Italy. This is largely set in what I would call the Tuscany region of this fantasy Italy, and it is just so good. I think, weirdly enough, I would probably say my attachment to the characters is not as high as it has been for some other books of Gavriel, but to me the writing here is just so exquisite. And there is a scene where they are at essentially a fantasy version of the Palio race in Siena, and it's just breathtaking. You're so invested in the race that your heart is racing too. So it's really fantastic. It really moves pretty fast. I think it's some of the most plot heavy of Gavriel's work. He's very much someone who's just really into the writing, in my opinion, which is why I really like him. But I think this one had a lot of intrigue and a lot of interesting character dynamics. And it does help, I think, if you probably have a background in other books that he has written. But I started here. I think this was my first Gavriel, and I did not feel lost at all. I felt like I was in really good hands. But this is my favorite of his, and I think in general I would say this is my favorite fantasy that is kind of Italian inspired. Next, let's talk about a current read of mine. I kind of feel controversially about this, but this is called House of Beating Wings, and this is a Kindle Unlimited fantasy romance that is about fae. And I know what you're thinking. Fae romance set in a fantasy version of Italy. Does it get better? It kind of doesn't. This is set in kind of a fantasy version of Venice. I think often when we're talking about Italian-inspired fantasy, it 9 times out of 10 is set in some world where it's very much like Venice. It's set on the canals. That's very hit and miss for me. And I think a lot of times it doesn't work for me. Like, I remember The Lies of Locke Lamora, it just wasn't for me at all. But I don't know that that had so much to do with setting as much as it did with the execution of the setting. This is interesting because it is about 2 different sets of fae. So the high fae, the full-blooded fae, and then the half fae live on 2 separate sides of essentially the Grand Canal in Venice. And this story is about our main character, Fallon, who is told towards the beginning of the story that she kind of has a royal future in store if she finds and frees 5 crows, 5 stone crows. And so there is kind of a mix here, not just of the Italian setting, but also kind of Celtic mythology, which you might expect since we're dealing with fae. I am about halfway through this. I am enjoying it, but I will say This is a very, very long book. It is the first in a series, and I just feel like it has taken so long to get up off the ground. I feel like at the point that I'm at now, we still haven't even met who's going to be the primary love interest. And in some ways that's really fun, that's really exciting because it's kind of keeping me on the edge of my seat a little bit. But at the same time, I would think that by this point, I would have an idea of where the book is going. I would have some excitement involved in it, but this one really is long. I think the world, honestly, is the most interesting part of it. I think it's far more interesting than a lot of the characters that we have met. I'm really interested in all the fantasy creatures here because there's a lot of talk about like dragons, basically, or serpents that live in the canals. And I just think that's so much fun. I really can envision the world. I think, honestly, when you set something in a world that is semi-like Venice, you automatically have a conception in your head of what it must look like. And I think that's why Venice is often favored as a setting in Italian-inspired fantasies. But this is just unique to me on every level. I just never thought that I would read a fae romance that was set in an Italianate world, and I am just really loving it for that alone. So this is one that I am currently really enjoying, but do keep in mind, it's very slow, and I feel like I can't even speak to at this point the romantic elements. There are very many different men in this book that I guess I could say are potentially love interests for the main character, but I get the sense that so far I haven't actually met the one. This may be a very interesting series where the author kind of plays the long game with us, but we'll see. Another book that I want to recommend, but I'm going to go on and say this is not a book that I really got on with, is This Vicious Grace. And this is a fantasy that is set in a world very much like Sicily. It is set on an island, and I feel like the descriptions are just very Sicilian. So this is a very interesting world, and I think that's kind of what held me back from loving it. There's a lot going on in this world. There's a lot to keep up with, and I found it relatively confusing. But this is about our main character, who is technically the savior of this world. There is an impending apocalypse, and everyone in the community thinks the savior is really going to make sure that this apocalypse doesn't occur. Now, what we as the audience and the main character, who is the savior, knows is that she doesn't really have any power whatsoever. And so she is surrounded by a lot of people who essentially want to kill her off to let another savior come up who actually can save them from this apocalypse. And so she hires a guy to be her bodyguard, and that's kind of the romantic element of the book, and that really was good. I love a good bodyguard romance myself, but I just found the concept of the apocalypse and the way in which it was described, that was very confusing to me. I feel like I need to reread this because I actually read this when I was traveling last year, and that is sometimes to the detriment of my reading experience, but it's really interesting. I think this is the first part of a duology, and I just really thoroughly enjoyed the Sicilian style world. I loved the description of what they were eating in particular. I thought that was really great. And to be a book that I feel like I didn't enjoy at the time, I have thought about this one quite a lot, and I've often contemplated, should I move forward with this series? And so I feel like the fact that I've just been thinking about it so much means that it really wasn't as bad as what I thought at the time. And it certainly lingered in my mind. I remember a lot of character aspects, and I really did like the dread that you felt as a reader, knowing that the time for the so-called apocalypse was growing closer as our main character didn't have any abilities to kind of stave it off. I thought there was a really great anxiety-inducing quality to the writing, and I really loved the romance here. So apparently I did like this book. I definitely need to reread it, but I thought the setting was so unique. When I picked this up, I did not know that it was Italian inspired at all, and I think that really kept me going when I felt like the book was dragging. Last of the books that I don't physically own is Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. And this is the only recommendation I have that is actually truly set in Italy. This is historical fantasy. It is set at some vague time in the past. From what I can recall, we were never really given any grounding as to what the actual time period is. This is set in Sicily, and it is about our main character whose sister is murdered at the very beginning of the book. And just through a bunch of different circumstances, she winds up getting involved with the princes of hell, who all have names associated with the 7 deadly sins. This was fun. I haven't yet carried on with this series. I think I'm going to reread the first book and just read all 3 in a go, but this was really fun. If you've read Kerri Maniscalco before, you know she kind of has a compulsive quality to her writing, and she often will incorporate kind of a mystery element into a lot of her novels, and I think that's really fun, and that makes you want to keep coming back and reading more. But I really loved the setting here, even though it really did frustrate me at times that I just didn't feel like I knew when we were. That was really bothersome to me. But really, what is so great about this book is just the description of food. The sisters own a restaurant, and so there's always this just great description of Sicilian food. They're constantly talking about eating cannoli. They're constantly talking about making like limoncello sangria, which is not a concoction that I knew we made, but now I am very much intrigued by that. The food writing in this was just incredible. It really made you hungry. And what I also liked about this was just everything that was going on. I thought was so interesting, and it was so kind of iconically Italian from the outside looking in. There was like a whole storyline with monks, which I just thought was fascinating. I really just enjoyed this on multiple different levels. It was really fun, and I think the rest of the series will be even better. That's my opinion, and that's what I've heard from a lot of reviewers, is that this is a trilogy that really does build on each previous book. So I'm really excited to carry on with the trilogy. And there's going to be a spinoff that's coming out this fall. So I hope that I really love the series so that I have something else to look forward to. Speaking of Fantasy Venice, there is a book that is a favorite of mine that is set in one of my favorite versions of Fantasy Venice, and that is Caraval by Stephanie Garber. And I'll go on and get it out of the way. Yes, Caraval is the weakest of the trilogy. And yes, Caraval is really the only one that truly feels Italian inspired to me. It seems like the other 2 in the trilogy had their moments, but this is set very much in a Venice-like city, and it's set on the lagoon. There is kind of a masquerade or carnival aspect to the game that's being played in this. I feel like this one has often made the rounds, and a lot of people just feel kind of controversially about it. Some people really love this, some people really hate it. For my money, it's good, but it's not great. To me, you really do just have to read this one to get to the next 2 in the trilogy, which are far and above this book. This really, I think, either should have been a trilogy that was a duology, or this book in general should have been separate from the other 2 in the trilogy, because it's so vastly different in tone and in storyline. But I really loved the setting here. This is the weakest book of Stephanie Garber's, in my opinion, in terms of characterization. She does such wonderful characterization and such wonderful romance in all of her other novels, but this one to me was the weakest, and I think that makes sense because this was her debut novel. What keeps you going here is that there is a game element, and that everything is very much an illusion. Is anything what it seems? That's constantly what you're asking yourself throughout this book. And I think the setting is what really aids that. I think that's what really made me enjoy this the first time that I read it, and then when I came back to it. I just really enjoyed the setting here. But if you're going to compare this to Once Upon a Broken Heart, it really doesn't compare, I'll be honest with you. But I still think it's fun. I think it's a great summer read, and I just think it really does feel like you're in Venice. Last but not least is a middle grade book that I felt kind of middle of the road about, but one thing that I really loved about it was the setting, and that is Momo by Ende. And I read this last year because my ultimate bias in K-pop, Suho from EXO, released an album that was all about this book. And so I really wanted to read this book before his album came out, and then I wanted to analyze the lyrics and just have a whole lot of fun. And I really did. I think that aided my enjoyment of the book to have something to analyze alongside it. And the fact that I was annotating it also really made me enjoy the book a whole lot more, in my opinion. But this book is set in an Italianate world. It also feels kind of Tuscany inspired in many ways to me. But it is essentially about time thieves. Men in gray suits come into this town and they start convincing people to give up hours, days, or years of their life to get something now. And it's a really interesting allegory. It's very, very interesting in a philosophical sense. But I think it is so wild that this is a middle grade book, because I certainly feel like if I was at middle grade age and I read this, 90% of the themes here would have gone right over my head. And I think it would be a hard sell for someone who is of middle grade age. I just don't think there's a lot going on in it. Other than these really interesting and I would say significant conversations, I don't know that this has really the pacing that you might think of as common in middle grade novels, but I enjoyed it as an adult, and I think I enjoyed it more as an adult than I ever would have if I was in middle grade age. This is one that I have often thought about coming back to because I just really enjoyed the process of annotating it. But to me, this one was really different, and I feel like it's very different from the others that I have recommended, which were really kind of adventurous, and they're fast moving, they're plot heavy. This, alongside A Brightness Long Ago, I feel like are dealing with deeper topics and deeper issues, and the writing is really beautiful in both of these books. So I think this is a pretty great quick read. Even though it wound up in some ways being a bit of a disappointment to me, I still really enjoyed the process of annotating it and interacting with the themes. So those are just a few Italian-inspired fantasy books that I would recommend you read. I would love to know down below if you have any other recommendations for Italian-inspired fantasy, and I would love to know if you have read any of these. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.